Hey, it's Dan Morales, and this is Homebuyer Radio. This is episode number 126, or at least I think it's episode number 126. So, part of the joy of creating my own content is the challenge of editing it, recording it, and kind of getting it all together. I talked about, wanting to take the podcast, to video podcast. And then some of the challenges of doing that. And then, of course, last week when I recorded the podcast, if you notice, there's some video podcasts that are still out there, Instagram TV and my Facebook channel. But there's also the audio podcast. Well, being the smart guy that I am, I record this, with a good old-fashioned high-quality microphone for the audio version of the podcast. And then I also record it on a video version with a different mic. So I'm actually wired two different ways. The beautiful part, though, is my high quality mic that I use for the audio portion, if you will. It didn't work. So I had to scrape the audio portion off of the mic I used for the video podcast. So fortunately, I'm a tech-loving nerd, so I was able to figure out how to make all this work. But it can be fun sometimes, right? So please know that this is a labor of love because part of what I've enjoyed doing in my 29 years of being a mortgage banker is just educating people, right? Because I believe a well-educated I'm tongue twisted today. A well-educated client has the opportunity to make a good informed decision. And I think what happens is so often, I run into clients where unfortunately, they've talked to different lenders throughout this process, and the lenders they've talked to have either given them information that is wrong or incorrect. And there's a lot of you that may be listening to this podcast have been told that you don't qualify for a mortgage when in fact you do. The problem was the person you spoke to didn't know how to get you to a point where you could qualify or how to properly structure your transaction in a way where you could qualify for a mortgage. And that's actually an episode that we've done in the past where, if you've been told for a mortgage, don't assume that, you truly can't qualify because your lender that you spoke to may not know how to properly structure your transaction and get you across the finish line. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is I want to talk about something that is becoming a little more frequent in the mortgage market, and that is what's called an appraisal waiver. Okay. Now, normally when you buy a house, you have to have an appraisal that's done to verify that the house is worth what you're paying for it, and in some cases, it's going to make sure that the property meets minimum property standards, let's say for VA or FHA or RD, which is the USDA home loan product. They're going to make sure that it meets those standards, right? And that the house is, generally readily marketable in its current condition, or, they'll do an appraisal taking into account renovations that are going to be done and so on. Long story short, there is somebody who goes out to that property who, does an inspection and puts together a professional report with, a lot of data as to what the value of that property is. And then they put together, data that, if you will, supports the conclusion that they've come to, okay? So what happens is that's been pretty norm, okay? If you go back to probably, I'd say, the early 2000s up through probably 2005, 2006, we got to a point where we started to see these appraisal waivers, okay? What the appraisal waiver was, basically it was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, with their scorecard coming back and saying, okay, on this particular transaction, we don't require that you have to have an appraisal, okay? Now, I don't know that anybody knows what exactly goes inside that black box of what determines whether or not you need an appraisal, but there were certainly a number of transactions where an appraisal was not required as part of the mortgage process, okay? Now, after the housing bubble, if you will, those things went away by and large part. You didn't see, appraisal waivers where, when somebody is buying a house, there was a waiver of the appraisal. We are starting to see those come back again here in, late 2018, 2019. We're starting to see those appraisal waivers come back, and they're going to come back in a much bigger way. What's happened is over the course of the last couple of years is the appraisal data that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac got was much more uniformed. They required the appraisers to turn in reports where the information that they were getting was much more uniformed versus it being kind of all over the board. With that uniform information, what they've built is one heck of a database, and that database gives them a really good idea of what properties are like in different neighborhoods, what values would be like in different neighborhoods, and so on, because they are the biggest sources of mortgage money in the country. So this database, they aggregate all this data, and I'm positive there's some, algorithm behind this that basically tells them if you're buying a property for $200,000 based on the data that they have available to them, they are highly confident that the house is worth what you're paying for it. In that case, it may offer you the ability to waive an appraisal. Okay. Now, if you're a buyer, you may think that that's really good news. Hey, I don't have to pay for an appraisal. Wow, I've saved $400, $500, $600 because I don't need an appraisal as part of this process. And of course, anytime you can save money, that is indeed a good thing. Now, the problem with that, though, is you still didn't have somebody go out to the property, okay? You didn't have an appraiser who knows the market, knows market values, go through that property to, inspect it, if you will, and to make sure that you really are getting what you're paying for, okay? Now, here's the thing, is you can make a compelling argument for both sides, okay? So I'm not saying I'm in favor of having to have an appraisal. I'm not saying I'm in favor of using the appraisal waiver. I'm just saying that, you want to look at both sides and you want to come to a conclusion for yourself as a borrower as to what you feel comfortable with. Because there are some clients that are very comfortable with, cool, I can save $400, $500, $600. I don't want to do the appraisal. Let's call it done and move on and get to closing that much faster, okay? And that may be totally acceptable for clients who are acceptable with that, okay? There are other clients who say, I still want to have somebody go through and tell me whether or not the property value is there and it's supported, okay? So you're going to see that, there are some clients who still want to do that even though they're eligible for it. And there are certainly pluses to that as well, too. So I wanted to just kind of bring this to your attention because, for those of you who are borrowing on a conventional mortgage, you are going to start to see a lot more of these appraisal waivers where you will have the option to waive an appraisal for the house you're buying. Just know, though, that there's potentially some risk there too, right? That what happens if all of the data that they aggregated was for all of the houses in the neighborhood around you that were better or nicer and really should have sold for more than your property did, and they're using that data to come up with a number that they feel comfortable with in regards to what your property is worth. So you just want to be careful there, okay? I think you definitely should talk to your realtor about that, get your realtor's opinion as to whether or not they think an appraisal waiver would be appropriate or acceptable, or if they think you should have an appraisal. Now, in some loans, you're going to have an appraisal no matter what, okay? They're typically going to be most of the government loans. So they'd be your VA, FHA, USDA, RD loans. All of those loans still require an appraisal and likely will continue to require an appraisal when you're buying a house, okay? On a conventional loan basis, you're going to see a lot more of these, right? And if you're a realtor that's listening to this podcast, just know you're going to see a lot more of them. As Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac continue down this road of, I like to say, I kind of feel like they're working towards eliminating the appraisal altogether. And I think there's good and bad to that, right? The good is, it moves things faster. It's less expense for a client, and transactions just close that much faster. The bad being that, I don't know that an algorithm can truly tell you what the value of a property is, right? If you think that is accurate or you think that's right, I would tell you, maybe go read some of the research that's been done on Zillow's Zestimates. Because as much as that's been out there, I think most people could agree that a Zillow's estimate is not always accurate, right? It's not always on the money. It's only as good as the data that they've been able to pull, and sometimes it's pretty accurate, and sometimes it's way off. So it's one of those new frontiers that we're going into in the mortgage lending business, right? As much as things change, they stay the same. I've back in the early 2000s, we've seen these things. They're coming back again. So you as a realtor, you should be in front of it. You should have an idea as to what maybe your position is going to be and what you think makes the most sense for your clients. For you as a client, if you have the opportunity to waive the appraisal, you want to make sure you have a really good conversation with your realtor in regards to what their advice would be and whether or not they think that's a good idea for you. Okay. Hey, my name is Dan Morales. NMLS number is 709729. My phone number is 616-931-4629. And of course, my website is just danmorales.com. That's DANMORALEZ.com. A couple of quick things I'd like to ask. If you are somebody who listens to this podcast, would you do two things for me, okay? The first one would be, would you please share it share it amongst friends, family, relatives who would benefit from the information, especially those who are looking to buy a property. You can share on Instagram. I'm on Instagram TV. I'm on Instagram as Dan the Mortgage Man. You can find me on Facebook as Dan the Mortgage Man as well. You can find Homebuyer Radio on Facebook too. But if you could share the content, that is a huge blessing to us, because it helps others just to kind of get into the family of Homebuyer Radio. And we've got 26 episodes of really good content that is meant to help educate people about the home buying process. And then the other thing I would ask is, if you get an opportunity, leave a review. For those of you who are listening on iTunes, leave us a review and let others know about the podcast. Okay, I'd appreciate it. Thanks a ton. Again, Dan Morales over at Northpointe Bank. Northpointe Bank is an equal housing lender. Have a great day.